called Presidents and Their First Ladies, Dramatically Speaking. This is a creation of William and Sue Wills. After 20 years of operating their own theatrical company in the resort town of Ocean City, Maryland, the couple started looking at the presidents and their first ladies. Now they're in their 20th year of bringing these stories to life. They have performed in 35 of our 50 states. We've had them here before, either once or twice. They are not impersonators, actually, but hope that their costumes, dialects, demeanors will help recreate these historical characters. They are a true working team. William researches all the history on the president and writes the script, and Anne creates the costumes, and many of them are her own designs. So I'm quite impressed with this couple. Today's story begins in late 1949 with a phone call. Please welcome the 40th President and First Lady, Ronald and Nancy Reagan. So I turn this off?
Hello?
Hello, is this Nancy Davis?
Yes, it is.
Well, this is Ronald Reagan, the president of the Screen Actors Guild. I understand you're upset because another actress with your same name has been listed on a roster of communist sympathizers. Well, I took care of it, but I've heard that you're still a little bit worried. So I was wondering if I might take you out to dinner tonight so I could explain everything in detail to you. However, Miss Davis will have to make it an early evening because, I do have an early movie call in the morning.
Oh, that would be fine, Mr. Reagan. I have an early movie call as well.
All right, I'll see you soon.
Bye. Of course, neither one of us had an early movie call. He got me home at 3 a.m. I think we hit it off. I've oftentimes said that my life began when I met my husband.
When that door opened, I found the rest of me that I needed to find to give me more happiness than any one person could ever possibly deserve. My life began when I met Nancy.
But Ronnie, you really had a full life up until then. You really should talk about it.
Well, on February the 6th, 1911, I, Ronald Wilson Reagan, was born in Tampico, Illinois. But the moment my father saw me, he thought I looked like a little Dutchman. So I was mostly known simply as Dutch to my family and friends. My mother was a fervent member of the Disciples of Christ Church, who taught me the value of prayer and to believe in my dreams. My father was an Irish Catholic, not so fervent. A tried and true Democrat who, oftentimes would go off on drinking binges. It was his illness, as my mother would put it. But he was also a born salesman. Now, because of that occupation, I had an older brother, Neil, we moved a lot in my early years. In fact, in one 4-year period, I attended 4 different schools. But finally, when I was 9 years old, we moved to Dixon, Illinois in 1920.
On July 6, 1921, I was born into the world of entertainment and named Anne Frances Robbins after my 2 grandmothers. My mother was already a well-established actress in touring shows with famous friends like Spencer Tracy. She and my father, Ken Robbins, separated around the time of my birth and eventually divorced in 1928. After their separation, to support herself, my mother had to resume her acting career full-time, so I spent the first few years of my life traveling with her as a backstage baby, but eventually I went to live with my aunt in Bethesda, Maryland. I missed my mother deeply and always looked forward to trips to New York to visit her, or when she would briefly stop by in Bethesda. And it was one of those trips that in 1929 it changed my life, as she told me she had met and wanted to marry Dr. Loyal Davis, a neurosurgeon in Chicago. She said that she would retire from the stage and we could all live together as a family, and she wanted my permission. I readily said yes. So as the 1930s began, I had a happy home with a loving stepfather in Chicago.
Now, I graduated from Eureka College in 1932, when the Depression was beginning and jobs were scarce. But my father came home one day and said that Montgomery Ward was going to open up a new store in Dixon, and they were looking for a local hero to head up their sporting department. Well, Montgomery Ward was one of the most solid companies you could work for. And if I got a job with them, my future could be secure. And I definitely thought I could be the fellow they would pick because I was pretty well known. I had been a lifeguard for 7 years, and I think I saved about 70 people from drowning. But they chose another fellow. And I really was heartbroken. But I had been taught God has a plan for all of us. And sometimes these random twists of fate are really all part of his plan. And you know, I've oftentimes thought, if I had gotten that job, I might never have left Dixon, Illinois. Well, as it was, I did leave, and eventually I got a job as a sports announcer for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. And well, that led to an incident that I just love telling folks about. In those days, WHO broadcast the Chicago Cubs baseball games. However, I would be in the studio in Des Moines, Iowa, sitting next to a fellow who had a teletype machine. He would get the barest of information sent to him from the press box, hand it to me, and then I'd embellish on it, making the folks out in Radio Land believe I was really at the game. Well, one day, this was a great game. It was the Cubs and the Cardinals. The bottom of the ninth, score was 0-0. The great Dizzy Dean was on the mound, and Billy Jurgis was at the plate. So I start to, describe Dean's windup, and the fella next to me hurriedly passes me a note. The teletype machine had gone dead. We had no idea what had happened at the ballpark, but I couldn't stop speaking, so I don't know how I did it, but quickly I thought of one thing I could say that wouldn't show up in the box score. So, Dean, here comes the pitch, and Jurgis swings, and oh my, it's a foul ball back into the stands. And would you look at that little red-headed boy? He caught the ball cleanly, and he's showing it off to all of his friends. The line was still dead. Well, Dean, he reaches down, picks up the rosin bag, and now he throws it down. He's looking in for the sign. He shakes it off. Now he nods yes. Here's the windup. Here's the pitch. Jurgis swings. It's a long fly ball down the left field line, and it curves foul into the stands. The line was still dead. For 7 long minutes, that line was dead, and I had poor Billy Jurgis foul off so many foul pitches that people would actually later in life come up and ask me if it was some kind of a Guinness World Book of Records. Oh, and when the machine got working again, you want to know what the message was? Jurgis, pop out, first pitch. And then occurred one of those tiny moments in a person's life that can just change a person's history. In those days, the Cubs spring training camp was actually out on Catalina Island off of California. And starting in 1935, I'd go out, spend a few weeks during spring training to get to know the players better. Well, in 1937, I arrived in LA, but I couldn't leave for Catalina because there was a terrible storm. So to kill time, I went to hear this girl, Joy Hodges, who had worked with me at WHO, sing at a local club. Well, I kind of already had this little dream of maybe becoming an actor. So Joy put me in touch with her agent, and next morning I had a screen test at Warner Brothers. But they didn't seem all that interested in me. So after my stint in Catalina was over, I headed back home to Iowa. But when I arrived, there was a telegram waiting for me. Warner Brothers was offering me a standard beginner's 7-year contract starting at $200 a week with options. Oh, that last part? Well, that meant they could fire me whenever they wanted to. So at the age of 26, I entered the world of entertainment in 1937.
Well, just before I graduated high school in 1939, Dr. Davis legally adopted me. Now, my mother had always called me Nancy for as long as I can remember, so now I was legally Nancy Davis. In high school, I was acting in school plays, and in my senior year, believe it or not, I had lead in the comedy First Lady, in which I was scheming to have my husband beat his opponent, this good-looking man from the West. I continued my schooling at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and continued acting in school plays. But after graduating in 1943, I returned to Chicago, but was soon pursuing my acting career in New York. I was surrounded by my mother's friends, Katharine Hepburn, Lillian Gish, Mary Martin, and Spencer Tracy. But my first role was a small part in the play Lute Song, which starred Mary Martin and Yul Brynner. I was in and out of plays for several years, but through the influence of Spencer Tracy, I was offered a screen test at MGM. So in March of 1949, at the age of 27, I was offered a standard beginner's contract starting at $250 a week. Now Ronnie and I were both in Hollywood.
But a lot had happened to me in Hollywood for the 12 years before Nancy arrived. In fact, in the first year and a half, believe it or not, I made 13 movies. Well, they were all, back then, what were called B movies. Very low budget, second half of a double bill. In fact, I became known as the Earl Flynn of B movies. And I knew something major had to happen to move you up to A movies. And sometimes, well, you have to take fate into your own hands. I had just become fascinated with the story of legendary Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne and his star player George Gipp, the Gipper. And I'd sit around at the commissary telling folks how I thought this would make a great movie script. Well, one day I bring the topic up again, and the fella I was talking to looked at me and said, "Reagan, you're too late. Warner Brothers has already started work on that picture." Well, I was stunned. I said, "Well, how did that happen?" And he laughed at me and said, "Reagan, you talk too much." The Warners heard about this idea. They got the rights. They've already cast Pat O'Brien to play Knute Rockne. I think they've already auditioned about 10 fellas for the Gipper. Well, I went right to that casting agent, and he took one look at me, and he said, "Nobody could ever believe I could be a football hero." So what did I do? I didn't take no for an answer. I went back. I pulled out an old picture of myself from Eureka College in my football uniform. I went back and I slammed it on his desk. I tested for, and I got the part. Well, how important was it to my career? Right after the preview, I had just gotten home when the telephone rang. The voice on the other side said, "Come in tomorrow morning. You're going to play General Custer in Santa Fe Trail opposite Earl Flynn." And also that year, 1940, was the year I did marry the actress Jane Wyman. And our marriage produced 2 lovely children, our daughter Maureen and our adoptive son Michael. I made 5 more movies in the next year and a half, culminating in King's Row, which was nominated for the Best Picture of the Year for the Academy Awards. But then, my career, like so many others, was put on hold when the United States entered World War II. Although because of my very poor eyesight, I was kept stateside. In fact, one of the testers said to me, "Reagan, if we send you overseas, you probably would shoot at one of our generals." And the fellow who was helping him chimed in with, "Yeah, but you'd miss him." So I was assigned Army Air Force Intelligence, and we came up with an innovative way to brief our bombardiers. Instead of just using maps and pointers, we began to create movies of the bombing runs, and this really helped our fellas a lot. And my stint there also gave me a chance to see the federal bureaucracy in its fullest glory. We needed additional storage space for very important war documents, and close to us was a warehouse, and it was filled with nothing but old, outdated, useless materials. So we wrote asking if we could destroy those materials, then use the space for our war documents. And believe it or not, Washington gave us the answer, yes, with a caveat. As long as you make copies of all the materials you destroy. That is exactly what it said. Well, after the war, I was still a staunch Democrat, and that got me into a lot of fights with my brother Neil, who had already become a Republican. I became active in the Screen Actors Guild. Well, I was its president for 5 years. And I came to realize that communism was a threat in this country. You know, the communists had a rather insidious tactic. They could gain control of an organization by becoming a small ruling minority. In fact, I would later learn that some of the groups I had joined had come under their influence. And then in 1947, during a major strike in our industry, it was later learned that that union was under communist influence. And sometimes their tactics could be pretty tough. I had to wear a gun for 7 months. When it was learned, they planned to attack me and throw acid into my face. And I did come to believe that there was some sort of a plan to try to incorporate this communist philosophy into our movies, which were then shown all over the world. I was called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, but I told them I believed our industry could police itself. And I ended that testimony by saying, and I never want to see our country, by either fear or resentment of this particular group, ever compromise any of our democratic principles trying to defeat them. However, there was a side effect to my becoming politically active. My marriage to Jane Wyman ended when she asked for a divorce in 1948.
Well, this was Ronnie's situation when we met over dinner to discuss that problem with my name. Well, we seemed to hit it off, and I tried to show interest in what he did by attempting several times to join the SAG board, unsuccessfully, I might add.
At first.
Well, he kept dating other women as well as me for almost 2 years.
You know, I was doing everything wrong. Simply dating her on and off, going away on these long trips, doing everything I could possibly do to lose her. And then one day, it just hit me. Let's get married.
Yes, let's.
You know, God must think a lot of me to have given you to me. Seeing you is like coming out of the cold into a warm, firelit room.
Several months later, we were married on March 4th, 1952, in the little brown church in the valley, with only our friends, actor Bill Holden and his wife, present. Well, I almost immediately had 2 families. Ronnie's children from his first marriage, Maureen and Michael, and soon we'd have a little girl of our own, Patty, born in October 1952, then Ronnie in 58. We had 2 homes, our own in Pacific Palisades out in the country, west of Hollywood, and one south of Malibu where Ronnie had his ranch, Yearling Row, where he bred, raised, and sold horses.
All seemed perfect. But then both of our careers took a nosedive. We were each without contracts at major studios. We became independents, and we struggled for a few years. Then in 1954, a job was offered to me, which, although I was very reluctant at first to accept it, would not only bring about some financial security for us, but would in its own strange way actually start me on my political career. And that was the television show, the GE Theater. For the next 8 years, I would introduce a series of live theatrical dramas and get to act in several every single year as well.
And I appeared under my stage name of Nancy Davis in 5 episodes, 3 co-starring Ronnie, including one entitled A Turkey for the President. Don't ask me what that was about because I don't remember. Neither does anyone else.
I don't think so.
Well, we were but then by financially secure, and in 1956 we built a new home, which GE wanted to use to showcase all the new, most modern electric appliances, refrigerators, ovens, special lighting, garbage disposal. Everything in that house was electric.
Well, except for the chairs.
There was a problem, though. Another aspect of the job was that Ronnie had to be GE's Goodwill Ambassador, visiting the 139 plants across the country. I think in 8 years, Ronnie was away from home a total of 2 years. But when he was away, he'd send me all kinds of loving notes and letters. February 14th may be Valentine's Day for ordinary people. I happen to have a Valentine's life, which started on March 4th, 1952, and will continue from now until forever and ever.
Well, at first I'd simply walk through the plants, shaking hands. Then I began to give little pep talks. That led to answering questions, and that led to giving speeches. And eventually the speeches became not about GE or my Hollywood career, but about how I viewed the country. People would ask me questions, I'd go home and I'd research, and it just opened my eyes to the tremendous amount of mismanagement and overspending in our government. No government has ever voluntarily reduced itself in size. And that became a theme of a lot of my speeches, and was one of the reasons why GE and I parted ways. That same year, my dear mother, Nell, finally passed over. For the last several years, though, she did not even know who I was. Back then, we called it senility, but I don't know. Maybe it was Alzheimer's disease. Mother, throughout her illness, would always say, I just keep my mind on God. Mother always expected to find the best in people, and you know what? She usually did. And that's a thought I've tried to keep in my mind as well.
Well, my parents were now living in Arizona, and I believe my father's conservative views began to influence Ronnie's views. Although still a Democrat, he voted for Eisenhower in 1952 and in 1956, and worked for Richard Nixon's election in 1960. But it was making a television speech for Barry Goldwater, one of my father's closest friends, that brought Ronnie to national attention in 1964. The speech was later referred to as a time for choosing.
Well, I began by explaining why I was changing from a Democrat to a Republican. But then I went on to state some of the following points. This country has an excessive tax burden. A government can't control an economy without first controlling its citizens. If this plan of government supporting individuals was so good, then shouldn't there be less people on its rolls by now instead of more? I was opposed to the growing bureaucracy and the increase in federal employment. I was becoming quite worried about the increased seizure of private property on both the state and federal level. And we should not appease the Soviet Union. Peace should not be purchased at the price of becoming slaves ourselves. And finally, I quoted Winston Churchill. There is something going on in time and space, and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We will preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we will sentence them to take that final step into 1,000 years of darkness. Of course, I didn't know it then, but those would be some of the same ideals I would be fighting for when elected president.
Well, Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson, but that speech launched Ronnie's political career, although we were still in denial. The pressure built on Ronnie to run for governor of California, so he said he would make a tour of the state to see what the people thought. After 6 months, he said to me,
Nancy, how can I say no to all these people who want me to run? But first, I had to win a hard-fought primary against an ex-mayor of San Francisco. In fact, his attacks on me became so nasty, it prompted our state Republican chairman to declare the 11th commandment, "Thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican." Well, I tried to live by that commandment in my political career.
well, Ronnie won the primary and then had to face the incumbent governor, Pat Brown, who I think believed Ronnie to be a joke. The joke was on him when for some reason he ran this horrible 10-second ad in which he was telling a group of grade school children, "I'm running against an actor." And remember, it was an actor that shot Abraham Lincoln. Well, Ronnie won in a landslide, 58 to 42%, and we moved to the governor's mansion. Mansion. I really should put a question mark at the end of that sentence, because that building was then almost 90 years old. and just years before had been declared a fire hazard. There were no fire escapes. But we did have a rope in our bedroom, which, yes, we could throw out a window and climb down. Doesn't that sound like fun? Well, a few months later, we moved into a house in the suburbs, for which we paid our own rent.
The state, which by law was supposed to have a balanced budget, had a $200 million deficit when I took over office. In my inauguration speech, I said, well, we are going to squeeze and cut and trim until we reduce the cost of government. It won't be easy, and it won't be pleasant. And I soon came to realize it also would not be enough. I didn't like it, but I did have to ask for a rather large tax increase. However, I told the folks as soon as we could, we would give some of their money back to them. 2 years later, when we knew we were going to have a surplus, I announced that when they filed their state taxes, they could take a 10% reduction, and we gave rebates on 3 other occasions during my terms as governor. Oh, and by the way, that did prompt one state Democratic leader to admonish me by saying, listen, giving the money back to the people is an unnecessary expenditure of public funds. But I also came into office when campus violence was at its peak, protesting the Vietnam War and other perceived injustices. In 1968 alone, there was over $1 million worth of damage done by vandalism, arson, bombings. There were 3 killings, and that was just on California campuses. I took a rather hardline approach, and I felt the problem were lax administrators who allowed peaceful protest to almost reach anarchy. And yes, at Berkeley University in 1969, I did call out National Guard troops to quell that protest. However, I met with the protesters, and I'll never forget, one of them looked at me, and he said, listen, he said that I and my generation would never understand the youth of that day, because he said, you weren't raised up in a time of instant communication, satellites, or fast computers. When you were young, you didn't live in the age of space travel, jet travel, or high-speed electronics. And I said, well, you're right. We didn't have those things when we were your age. We invented them. Now, when you're an elected official and you make tough decisions, you're going to be criticized. In fact, I think I was burned in effigy so often, I helped the gasoline sales in the state of California. But I'm a public official, and people have every right to protest my policies. But my wife wasn't an elected official, and sometimes I think she was attacked as much as I was.
Well, Ronnie did not like personal confrontation or firing people, and at times, some people did not give him objective advice, but he thought highly of mine. I know some joked that I had my own NBI, Nancy's Bureau of Investigation, but if I felt there was someone harming my husband, I would suggest they be fired. Our close friend Mike Deaver once commented, Ronnie got to don the white hat, while Nancy was portrayed as the Wicked Witch of the West.
Well, Nancy's gotten a bum rap. Oh, I know, she's been accused of being the shadow governor, later the shadow president, but she never interfered on policy issues. Of course, I valued her opinion, but she also knows I can be pretty stubborn when I disagree with her.
Well, Ronnie was reelected in 1970, and when his term of governor ended in 75, I honestly thought we were leaving politics behind forever. But we had something wonderful to look forward to, especially Ronnie, a new ranch. We had sold Yearling Row before the governorship, and Ronnie had just purchased this beautiful ranch out near Santa Barbara, Tip Top Ranch.
Which we renamed Rancho del Cielo, Ranch in the Sky, because it sat atop a mountain range and it had only a 1-lane road access to it. No other place has given Nancy or me the peace and the enjoyment and happiness that this ranch has. Well, I busied myself with speeches, but then I began a 5-minute radio address and began to write a syndicated newspaper column. I researched every story, I wrote them all myself, and this gave me a chance to examine issues on a national level and to really solidify my thinking on a whole range of topics. But that all came to an end in about 6 months or so, because I announced I was going to challenge the sitting Republican President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford, for the Republican nomination in 1976. And that primary went all the way to our convention. And there, on the first ballot, I lost by only 117 votes.
Oh, Jerry Ford then lost to Jimmy Carter. But 4 years later, 1980, with inflation over 14%, and with Carter's own creation for the 1976 campaign, the Misery Index, which was inflation plus unemployment rates, now at over 20%, the stage was set for Ronnie's election. But it was 2 stage appearances and 2 sentences, really, that helped Ronnie win that election. But first, he had to win the primary. There were 7 candidates, although George Bush and my husband were the frontrunners. In New Hampshire, the Nashville Telegraph was sponsoring a debate, but it was only to be between Bush and Ronnie. Bob Dole, another candidate, said that would be an illegal contribution to our 2 campaigns. So Ronnie decided to pay all the expenses himself and invite all of the candidates. However, when they walked out on stage, there were only 2 chairs. Well, the moderator started to ask the others to leave, so Ronnie began speaking to a now upset crowd to explain what was happening. Well, the moderator, acting like his newspaper was still sponsoring the debate, shouted, "Turn Mr. Reagan's microphone off."
Is it still on? Listen, I'm paying for this microphone, Mr. Green.
Ronnie then explained why he thought all should participate, and the crowd went wild. That became an important moment in the campaign. Then, during the one debate between President Carter and Ronnie, when the president for the umpteenth time distorted Ronnie's statements, he reclaimed,
There you go again. In closing, I basically ask, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If yes, vote for my opponent. But if no, vote for a change.
Well, one of the changes people wanted to see was the release of the 52 American hostages being held in Iran. Ironically, Election Day marked the 1-year anniversary of their capture from the embassy, and Ronnie won. Then President Carter worked up to the very last minute he was in office to bring about the release of those hostages. And on January 20th, 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan was sworn in as our 40th President of the United States. I held the old taped-together Bible that had belonged to Ronnie's mother, open to a verse that said, "If a nation seeked the face of God, he would heal their land."
So help me God. My fellow citizens, in this present economic crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Government can and must provide opportunity, but not smother it. And by the way, those who say we're living in a time of no heroes, well, they just don't know where to look. Our farmers who provide food for us and for the rest of the world, our entrepreneurs who believe in themselves and provide jobs, families and individuals whose taxes support our government and whose contributions support the charities and churches. Their patriotism is quiet but deep. Their values sustain our national life. As for the enemies of freedom, we will remind them that peace is our highest priority, and we will negotiate and sacrifice for it. But we will never surrender for it, now or ever. No weapon is as formidable as the will and the moral courage of free men and women, and we as Americans have that. The crisis we face today is going to require our very best effort, our willingness to believe in ourselves, to believe we still can do great things, and to believe that with God's help, we can solve all the problems facing us today. And, well, after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are all Americans.
We then retired to the Capitol where a luncheon was being held, and President Reagan made a dramatic announcement.
With thanks to Almighty God, 30 minutes ago, the plane bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace, and they are free of Iran. And I then decided that it should be Jimmy Carter who should go to Germany to greet them.
Ronnie was just shy of 70 years old when he began his presidency, our oldest president. And I wanted to make sure he had a home he could be proud of. But I soon discovered that both the White House and Blair House, where foreign dignitaries were housed, were in great need of refurbishment. It took 6.5 years and $10 million just to bring Blair House up to snuff. Plus, we had the extra expense of housing dignitaries in hotels. Nobody complained about that. Well, but the White House, now that was another matter. I believe strongly that the White House is a special place and should have the very best of everything. We were allocated $50,000 to renovate the family quarters. Well, it cost me $800,000, all of which I raised by private donations. The White House china was by now almost piecemeal. A complete set had not been ordered since the Truman administration. So we acquired a new set of Lenox china, which cost $209,000. But it was purchased by the Knapp Foundation and donated to the White House. Notice, I did not say that we bought it. I thought I'd be praised. Instead, I was called Queen Nancy, and even worse. Well, on March 30th, 10 weeks after taking office, I had just returned to the White House from a luncheon when suddenly the head of my Secret Service team appeared and told me that there had been a shooting at the hotel where the president was speaking. Some people are wounded, but your husband was not hurt.
A poor soul named John Hinckley emptied his gun at me to prove his love for the actress Jodie Foster. And the first report to Nancy turned out to be wrong. I had just finished giving a speech at the hotel. We came out the side entrance. There was a group of people. So as we approached the car, I turned to wave. Pop, pop, pop. What the hell is that? All of a sudden, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy jumped spread-eagled in front of me, and he took a bullet in the chest that was meant for me. And then a Jerry Pat, he threw me on the back of that car, his whole body pressing down on me. I felt such pain in my back. I yelled, "Jerry, get off of me. I think you've broken a rib."
Ronnie began spitting up blood. They rushed him to George Washington University Hospital, where fortunately there was a conference of the hospital's top surgeons taking place.
Someone was looking out for us that night, Nancy.
Well, at first the hospital personnel did not know that Ronnie had been shot until they noticed a small puncture wound under his left arm. When I arrived at the hospital, I discovered that not only had press secretary Jim Brady been shot in the head and 2 others wounded, but that Ronnie had been hit as well. I demanded to see him. Ronnie lifted the oxygen mask and said,
"Honey, I forgot to duck."
When they took him to the operating room, Ronnie looked at the array of doctors and said to the one nearest him,
"I hope you're a Republican."
To which the doctor replied, "Today, Mr. President, we are all Republicans." Well, during the operation, they found the flattened bullet, which had gone into the 7th rib and then deflected to the lower left lung, missing his heart by an inch.
Like I said, someone was looking out for us that day.
Well, after a few days, my husband seemed to be recovering well when suddenly his temperature shot up to 103 degrees. He again began spitting up blood. Ronnie developed pneumonia. His lower left lung had collapsed, but the doctors did not want to risk another operation. He was in great danger again, although the public was never told of this incident. Well, that crisis passed, and Ronnie recovered enough to return home on April 11th.
And that night, I wrote in my diary, "Whatever happens now, I owe my life to God, and I will try to serve Him in every way I can." Just 1 week later, to an enormous standing ovation at my entrance, I addressed a joint session of Congress, explaining and asking them to pass our tax reform package, cutting taxes by 30% and reducing the cost of government. This was going to be our centerpiece of restarting this economy. And with some revision, just months later, the bill was passed with bipartisan support, just as several years later, again, we had great bipartisan support to reform Social Security. Now, on the international front, well, we in the Soviets had a rather unusual nuclear policy. It was referred to as MAD, M-A-D, Mutual Assured Destruction. I began a series of private letters to the Russian leaders. There would be 4 different ones in my 8 years as president, calmly explaining our position, but also letting them know I did believe in peace through strength. In 1983, in Orlando, Florida, during a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, well, I expressed 2 important ideas that I felt showed the contrast between us and the Soviets. I tell you, there are a great many God-fearing, dedicated, noble men and women in public service, well, present company included. And yes, we need your help to keep us ever mindful that freedom prospers only where the blessings of God are avidly sought and humbly accepted. Now contrast that with the Marxist-Leninists. They repudiate all morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas. So let us pray for those who live in that totalitarian darkness, the Soviet Union. Pray that they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while the Soviets preach supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all the peoples on earth, the Soviets are the focus of evil in the modern world.
From then on, Ronald Reagan and the Soviet evil empire would be linked. Well, the next years moved quickly and were filled with many events. I began my Just Say No to Drugs campaign, which in years to come would cause me to travel to 33 states, 8 foreign nations, and to Vatican City for an audience with the Pope. Some 12,000 Just Say No clubs would be formed. In 1985 and 86, I'd hold conferences to combat drug abuse with first ladies from 30 different countries. Then in 1988, I became the first sitting First Lady to address the United Nations Committee, which was meeting on youth, family, and crime prevention. And I stated, if we lack the will to fully mobilize the forces of law in our own country to arrest and punish drug pushers and users, if we cannot stem the American demand for drugs, then there is little hope of preventing foreign drug producers from fulfilling that demand. We will not get anywhere if we place a higher burden of action on foreign governments than on America's own mayors, judges, and legislators. You see, the cocaine cartel does not begin in Medellin, Colombia. It begins in the streets of New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and every other American city where crack cocaine is bought and sold. Why was this so important to me? Because every time a drug enters a child, something else is forced out, like love and hope, trust and confidence. Drugs take away every dream in a child's heart and replace it with a nightmare. Well, was the effort effective? All I know is marijuana usage went from 33% of high school seniors in 1980 to 12% in 1991. And there were major decreases in other drug use categories as well. But I've jumped ahead of myself. You see, even after that first year, the press still seemed to find me aloof. So I decided to show them that Nancy Reagan was not a stick in the mud. We were at the Gridiron Club dinner, and during the skits, everyone in Washington is fair game for roasting, but one skit really seemed to affect Ronnie.
A woman, obviously dressed to look like and represent Nancy, sang a song to the tune of Secondhand Rose, ridiculing Nancy's so-called obsession with clothes. Well, I'll tell you, I think they went a little bit too far on this occasion, and I guess my wife did because she got up and she walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there all alone. Everybody's eyes was focused on me. But I and everybody else soon came to realize that the joke was on us, because in a couple of moments, the curtain opened and Nancy decided to turn the tables herself.
Second-hand rose, I'm wearing second-hand clothes. They're all the rage in the spring fashion shows. Even my new trench coat with fur collar, Ronnie bought for 10 cents on the dollar.
Well, I commented, well, I came here one happy husband, and I'm leaving as a stage door Johnny. What happens at the Gridiron Club is supposed to remain absolutely private, but this was too stunning not to make the news.
One headline read, "She sings, she jokes, she's a hit." Dear Glamour Puss, I can never get enough of kissing you. You are the light of my life. I love you mucher and mucher each day. Your roommate.
Yes, my deep relationship with Nancy wasn't hurt by the pressures of the presidency. However, my relationship with certain government workers was challenged the very first year I was in office. On August the 3rd, almost 75% of the members of PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union, went out on strike in violation of a sworn no-strike clause in their contract. I gave them 48 hours to return to work. A few of them did, but most of them did not. I guess they all thought I was bluffing. I was not. I fired them. I had been the president of a union for 5 years. I was a lifetime member of the AFL-CIO, but no president could ever put up with an illegal strike by federal workers. Yes, of course, air flight was curtailed, but the disasters that were predicted didn't occur, and the country just kept right on operating. Oh, just a couple of weeks after that, another major event. 2 of our F-14s were fired upon by 2 Libyan jets, and following my rules of engagement, our jets simply shot down the Libyan jets. This was the first of many confrontations with Gaddafi, who already was sponsoring terrorism all over the world. Then in 1984, when he had his imprints all over the bombing of a discotheque in Berlin, well, 2 years later, we finally bombed his military headquarters, and that pretty much quieted him for a while.
Well, there were 2 things that were very important to me. I wanted to be a good wife and a good mother. I think I was successful at the first, but not so much at the latter. It was hard being a blended family. Over the years, estrangements between our children would become the norm. Apparently, at times, they felt that because Ronnie and I cared so much for each other, they felt that there was little room in our hearts for them. Maureen and I did grow closer during the White House years as she became very interested in politics. Michael had the additional burden of being adopted and, as he later explained to us, had been the victim of sexual abuse by a camp counselor when he was a boy. We supported our son Ronnie's pursuit of a dancing career, and then there was Patty, my own flesh and blood daughter. She had a rebellious spirit and deeply hurt both of us when she wrote a fictional book which mirrored the life of our family. It was very unflattering, to say the least.
Yes, there were family problems and many problems in the world, communism and terrorism. But ironically, the first was beginning to crumble while the latter was beginning to grow. In Poland, the Solidarity movement was growing, and we helped them by putting sanctions on the Soviet-supported government there. This would be the spark that would encourage other countries in Europe to finally throw off the communist rule of domination. But communism was still trying to spread here in our own hemisphere, and Cuba became the main exporter of this evil philosophy. Our October 1983 successful invasion of the tiny island of Grenada, where there had been a buildup of Cuban troops, stopped the spread in the Caribbean. Now, over in Central America, it was a little different. Nicaragua was the main central point there, and there, instead, we decided to use covert activities, helping the Contras, who were already fighting against the pro-communist Sandinista government.
Well, only 10 months after Ronnie became president, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who had signed the historic Camp David Accords, was assassinated by Muslim fundamentalists. Egypt stayed stable, but neighboring Lebanon was another story. There, the Soviet Union and Iran were fueling the civil war between the Christians, the Muslims, and the Druze. And the situation turned tragic.
First, in April of 1983, the American embassy was attacked with a car bomb, killing many, including 16 Americans. Then on October the 23rd, a truck bomb destroyed our Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Marines. Just moments later, 58 French soldiers were killed in a similar style attack, and these men were there as part of the peacekeeping troops. Yes, we wanted to retaliate, but against whom? Was it Hezbollah backed by Iran? Or was it the Druze militias backed by Syria, who in turn was being backed by the Soviet Union? Eventually, France, Great Britain, and the United States, we all pulled out our peacekeepers as Lebanon deteriorated into chaos. And the radicals had also begun to add kidnapping to their terrorist activities, taking our CIA agent chief, William Buckley, then the head of the Catholic Relief Services in Lebanon, and several others. And this would become the most frustrating of endeavors, trying to secure their release, but not giving in to the demands of their captors. And this would be a problem that would eventually link our efforts in Central America with those in the Middle East and bring about the biggest scandal in my administration. But more on that later, because first, I had to get reelected.
Well, the Democrat candidate in 1984 was Walter Mondale. And Ronnie's economic policies had fueled a terrible recession, but it had eventually started a tremendous economic recovery and expansion. Well, Mondale and Ronnie were to meet in 2 debates. The first was the worst night of my husband's political career. It was a Ronald Reagan I had never seen before. He looked confused, absolutely terrible. He would have to do better in the second debate, which he did. But it was the answer to one particular question that people remembered. A questioner from the Baltimore Sun brought up the age factor. Ronnie would be 74 years old. Mondale was only 56. With a stern, serene face, Ronnie answered,
I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Well, the audience laughed. Mondale laughed, and you know what? The election might have been won right there and then. Ronald Reagan and George Bush defeated Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro in a landslide, losing only Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Well, Inauguration Day was so cold, with a predicted wind chill of 20 below, that Ronnie took the oath of office indoors in the rotunda of the Capitol. I wanted that oath to be given at 3 minutes before noon, the time suggested by my astrologist, Joan Quigley. I've been consulting Joan since 1973 when Ronnie was governor of California. Besides general readings, she would suggest the best time for certain events and trips. Joan had chosen the time, predicted Ronnie would leave office as one of the beloved and esteemed presidents, but added there would be trouble ahead.
Well, that was an understatement. 1984 ended on a very disappointing note. Congress voted to cut off all military funding to the Nicaragua Contras. I could not understand why they did not see the importance of stopping the spread of communism right there and then. But I made it very clear to my staff that although we certainly could not break the law, well, we still wanted to do all we could to help the Contras. Now, as 1985 started, Hezbollah still had our captives. Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. A TWA airliner was hijacked. And then the Italian cruise ship, Achille Lauro, was hijacked. And those terrorists executed a 69-year-old disabled American, Leon Klinghoffer, and threw his body overboard.
Well, at the same time, Ronnie underwent surgery in July for colon cancer. Then again on January 17th, 1986. 11 days later, a real American tragedy occurred. The space shuttle, Challenger, exploded after takeoff, killing all aboard, including the young teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who had already captured the hearts of Americans, especially school children around the country. As president, my husband addressed the nation and ended the speech with these words.
And we will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning. As they prepared for their journey, they waved goodbye, and they slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
That explosion touched all Americans. But already there was something simmering that would cause a political explosion in the presidency of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Iran-Contra.
Through Israeli sources, we received word that there was a moderate element in Iran that could help free the hostages held by Hezbollah. But in return, they wanted weapons by which they might change the government in Iran. Well, we had heard that the Ayatollah Khomeini was quite ill. The plan was for Israel to actually sell the weapons to those moderate Iranians. Then they would replenish their stockpile by buying new weapons from us. And almost immediately after that first shipment was made, the Reverend Benjamin Weir, who had been held captive for over 16 months, was released. And down the road, 2 others were released. The plan was actually working. And then came the bombshell. Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of the transfer of payments, had diverted some of the money to help the Nicaragua Contras. And even worse, John Poindexter, who was the head of the National Security Council, knew of it. When I learned, I went on television the next day and told the nation. Poindexter immediately resigned, Colonel North was relieved of his position, and John Tower formed a commission to investigate the entire matter.
Ronnie did not know about this, but his chief of staff should have. I persuaded Ronnie to replace Donald Reagan, with whom I'd had numerous disagreements. For the first time, people did not trust Ronnie, but as usual, he did not let it depress him. Well, while all this was unfolding, Ronnie was attempting to solidify relations with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Again, letters between the Russian leader and the American president formed the basis, and an encouraging meeting in Geneva had shown promise in actually reducing, not just limiting, nuclear weapons stockpiles.
And then negotiations hit a sour note in Reykjavik, Iceland. I had made it very clear that there was one position that was not negotiable. There could be absolutely no restrictions put on our starting research for the Strategic Defense Initiative. Oh, I know. Back then it was derogatorily and incorrectly, by the way, referred to as Star Wars. The idea was simple but extremely difficult. Develop a system of rockets that could actually intercept nuclear warheads before they reached their targets. And if we were able to develop this technology, we would share it with countries willing to give up their nuclear weapons. On the final day of this conference, by the way, it had been going pretty well, Mikhail suddenly demanded that we stop all work on this very important program. Well, he did not play by the rules. So I angrily said, well, then this meeting is over. And I walked out.
Well, Ronnie kept the pressure up on the Soviet leadership, and just about a year later, on June 12, 1987, standing at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, he said,
"Behind me stands a wall that divides the free sectors of the city, a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. Freedom leads to prosperity, and the Soviets may, in their own limited way, be coming to realize the importance of freedom. But there is one sign the Soviets could make that would be unmistakable. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open the gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
6 months later, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the first treaty to actually destroy nuclear weapons. 2.5 years after that, the Berlin Wall came down. And in 2 more years, the Soviet Union was officially disbanded.
Now, maybe the people of Eastern Europe could enjoy a taste of freedom. Although, according to an old joke, they always had. You see, there was this American and a Russian, and they were discussing the merits of their political systems. And the American says to the Russian, well, you know, in America, I have freedom. If I wanted to, I could go to the White House, go into the Oval Office, pound my fist on the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running this country. And the Russian fella, he says, well, I could do that. And the American says, you can? He says, sure. I could go to the Kremlin, right into the General Secretary's office, pound my fist on his desk, and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan is running his country. Well, there's no doubt that that week in June of 1987 was certainly a highlight of my presidency. But only 4 months later, Nancy and I would undergo some of the hardest weeks as husband and wife.
On October 6th, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. 12 days later, the operation took place. Ronnie and I had decided on removal, hopefully making the result of the operation conclusive. When Ronnie came into the hospital room after that operation, I said, they took my breast. I feel so sorry for you.
That's all right, honey. I've always been a leg man myself. I love you, and I always will. 9 days later, Nancy's mother passed over. It wasn't unexpected. Edith had been ill for a while, but it touched Nancy deeply because they had a unique relationship as mother and daughter, just as we had a pretty unique relationship as husband and wife. During my final State of the Union message, before the entire country, I turned to Nancy and said, Nancy, you have helped so many of our young people to just say no to drugs. I want to express to you your husband's pride and your nation's thanks. I surprised you, didn't I? What I was trying to say was, Nancy, thank you for lighting up my life for almost 40 years. But what do you say to someone who gives your life meaning? Someone who's always there with support and understanding? Someone who makes sacrifices so your life will be easier and more successful? Well, you say, you love that person and you'll treasure them always. I just could not imagine the last 8 years without Nancy by my side. I gave one final speech from the Oval Office, and in it I said the following. I've been called the great communicator. Well, I'll accept it, but I never really thought it was the style or the words that made a difference, but it was the content. I did communicate great ideas, but they did not spring full bloom from my brow. They sprang from the heart of a great nation, from the experience, the wisdom, and our belief in principles that have guided this country for over 200 years.
But that would not be Ronnie's last communication to the country. That would come on November 5th, 1994, in a letter to the nation.
My fellow Americans, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. At the moment, I feel fine. I intend to live the remainder of the years that God gives me on this earth, doing the things I've always done. Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience, but I know that with your help, she will face it with faith and courage. In closing, let me thank you, the American people, for giving me the great honor of allowing me to serve as your president. When the Lord calls me home, I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin this journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life, but I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead.
Thus began my long, long goodbye with Ronnie. I rarely left his side. One of those occasions was when I went to Washington in 2002 to receive the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor awarded to both Ronnie and me. Another was when I received an individual award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But those lonely years were taken up with watching Ronnie's eyes go from weary pleading for something to be done, mingled with fear, into eyes receding into lost resignation, to some place so distant, but with the fear seeming to disappear. Ronnie's journey came to an end on June 5th, 2004. The official cause of death was pneumonia. He was 93 years old. A 7-day state funeral was held with services in both Washington, D.C. and at the Reagan Presidential Library. Well into my 90s, and although being frail and having suffered several serious falls, I still visited Ronnie's grave every year. I still felt his presence every day, and often found him in my dreams at night.
And on March the 6th of this year, Nancy and I were joined together again in the hereafter.
My husband was known as the great communicator. He gave so many wonderful speeches. We'd like to leave you with just a few of those words.
Well, I'll tell you what I believed all of my life. America is a shining city on a hill. But the greatness of America doesn't begin in Washington. It begins in each of you, in the mighty spirit of free people under God, in the bedrock principles you live by every day, in your families, your neighborhoods, and your workplaces. Each of you is an individual worthy of respect, unique and important to the success of America. Only by trusting you, in giving you the opportunities to climb high and to reach for the stars, can we preserve this golden dream of America as the champion of peace and freedom among all the nations of the world. We are indeed, and we are still today, the last best hope of man on earth. Thank you. Well, thank you, folks. Please be seated. It's nice to say that. I guess that means you're standing. Roberta, thank you for having us. I hope we brought back some memories of the Reagans and memories maybe of part of your lifetime as well. You know, Sue and I have been here many, many occasions. We are neighbors. We don't live far from here at all. So I'll fill you in on something. This is our 34th presidential couple we've researched and written, and this is the couple I really was looking forward to doing the most. Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I get to say, I think, some of the most inspiring words, and every time we do this show, I just love some of the thoughts that Reagan had. Whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, whatever, you have to believe that in his heart, this man truly did love this nation. The other reason was, of course, well, Sue and I, Next year, 2017, will mark our 40th year as professional performers. That's pretty unique. So, of course, you know, you haven't, well, that's all right. Appreciate it. So we had to do the performing act, you know, the actor who became president. And when I met my wife in 1970, I very boldly told her I would become president by 1996. And I was very true to my word. By that time, I think I was 31 presidents already. And let me tell you, it's a lot easier doing this than doing that job in Washington. So thank you all. We usually stay around and socialize with you, but we do have a family situation, and so we will have to leave pretty quickly. We'll stay here for a few moments. If anybody has any real question they want to ask us, come down front, all right? Roberta, thank you again for having us. God bless you all.
So yes, please do. That was a stellar performance. It was absolutely marvelous. I thought Ronnie was on the stage. So we share your joy, no matter the political party, really. What professionals you are. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying around for a few minutes, folks, if you want to say a word to them, and then we'll adjourn for the evening. Thank you so much.